You know that feeling, right? Just information overload. Your feeds, emails, it's everywhere. Sometimes you just need someone to cut through all that noise and tell you what actually matters. Yeah. And that's what we're trying to do here in these deep dives, give you the key stuff, those aha moments on things that have real impact. So today we're digging into something pretty significant. It's a recent U.S. Supreme Court decision, unanimous actually, and it directly affects military veterans. Specifically, a special kind of combat-related compensation they might receive.
That's right. Our mission today really is to unpack this Supreme Court ruling from June 12th, 2025. It's Sodto versus United States, and the whole case hinges on something called combat-related special compensation, CRSC for short. These are really vital payments for veterans who have disabilities directly from their combat service. And the big question, the core issue, was whether this common government time limit, it's called the Barring Act, whether that applies here. Because if it did, it could potentially cut off years of benefits these veterans were owed.
Yeah, and we want to frame this, as a story. It starts with a Marine Corps veteran, Simon Sodto. He served in Operation Iraqi Freedom, and his personal fight, really, is what brought this whole legal question up to the Supreme Court. Now, okay, there's definitely some legal language involved. We can't avoid all of it. But our goal here is to break it down, make it clear, use everyday terms so it's useful for you, whether you're a vet yourself or family, or honestly, just someone interested in how these big decisions affect actual people. So let's get into it. Okay, so let's maybe start with the basics. The sort of standard rule for making a claim against the government. There's this general law, it's like a timer, called the Barring Act. Technically, it's Title 31, Section 3702 of the U.S. Code. Basically, the government's rule book for claims. It sets up the default process. And critically, it has this general 6-year time limit. Think of it like the standard window. You've got 6 years to make most claims, or you lose the chance.
Right, but here's the crucial part. The Barring Act itself has an exception built right in. It actually says that if another law, that's the key phrase, if another law provides its own authority to settle a claim, then that specific law takes over. It displaces the Barring Act's rules, including that 6-year clock. So the whole legal fight really becomes what counts as another law that has its own settlement authority. When does a specific statute meet that test?
And that's exactly where CRSC comes in, Combat-Related Special Compensation, Title 10, Section 1413A. So Congress passed this back in 2002. It's for special payment to military retirees with combat-related disabilities. And this is important because usually with standard VA disability benefits, veterans often have to give up or waive part of their military retirement pay to get the disability pay. It's kind of an offset. But CRSC is different. It lets these combat-disabled retirees get this special compensation up to the amount of retirement pay they waived. Yeah. So basically, they aren't forced to choose between the two, right? What was the thinking behind creating this whole separate system? Why was this specific compensation seen as so important?
That's a really good question. And if you look back at the history, CRSC was basically Congress recognizing that, well, combat disabilities are different. They're unique. Initially, it was only for veterans who'd served 20 years or more. But then there was this really key amendment. It took effect January 1st, 2008. And that change expanded CRSC to cover all combat disabled retirees who are eligible for retirement pay. It didn't matter how long they served anymore. So that really broadened the group of veterans who could get this benefit. It was a clear signal, that Congress wanted to support these specific veterans.
Okay, so let's bring in the person at the heart of this, Simon Sodto. Served in the Marines 2000 to 2006, did 2 tours in Operation Iraqi Freedom. And during his first tour, his assignment was mortuary affairs. I mean, that's searching for, recovering, processing remains of casualties in a war zone. Just incredibly difficult work. You can only imagine the kind of toll that takes, mentally and emotionally. And his journey after service, well, it wasn't easy. He really struggled adjusting back to civilian life. He was medically retired in 2006 because of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And his doctors directly linked that PTSD to his combat experiences. The VA later gave him a 100% disability rating for it, which means, total impairment affecting work, social life, just a huge impact.
Right. And here's where the legal part really kicks in. In June 2016, so 10 years after he retired, Sodto applied for those CRSC payments we were just talking about. And the Secretary of the Navy, his branch, they approved his application, they recognized he was eligible, but, and this is the key point, they limited his back pay, his retroactive compensation, only back 6 years to July 2010. And the reason they gave, that Barring Act, that 6-year time limit. So that immediately raised the question, wait, should that general time limit apply to this very specific benefit for combat vets?
And Sodto didn't just accept that. The very next year, he filed a class action lawsuit. His argument was straightforward. The Barring Act's 6-year limit should not apply to CRSC. Why? Because, he argued, the CRSC law itself is that another law. It has its own way of handling things, its own settlement mechanism, and therefore he should get payments going all the way back to January 1st, 2008. Remember, that's the date the eligibility expanded. He wanted everything he was owed from that point on, not just the last 6 years.
So the first court to hear this, the district court, they actually agreed with Sodto. They granted summary judgment for him and the class he represented. They basically said, yeah, the CRC statute does lay out who's eligible, how benefits are calculated, tells the secretary what to do, and in their view, that was enough. It functioned as another law and pushed the Barring Act aside.
But then it went up to the next level, the Federal Circuit Court. And they saw it completely differently. They reversed the decision. Their reasoning was much stricter. They said to push aside the Barring Act, a law needs to explicitly grant settlement power. Often, they said, by using the actual word settle or some other really specific language, or it needed its own separate time limit written into it. So the Federal Circuit basically said, look, CRSC doesn't have those magic words, so the Barring Act still applies.
Right.
Full stop. That feels really rigid, doesn't it? Was that sort of the standard legal thinking, or was that view a bit controversial itself?
Oh, it was definitely seen as rigid. You're right to pick up on that. It's what lawyers might call a more formalistic approach, just looking for specific words. And what's really interesting is, even within the Federal Circuit Court, there wasn't full agreement. Judge Rayner wrote a strong dissent. He argued, no, wait a minute. The parts of the CRSC law that explain how to determine eligibility and figure out the payment amounts, that is the settlement process. He saw the mechanism itself as the authority, a less rigid reading. So it shows you, even the judges were split on how to read this.
And that's why the Supreme Court decided to take the case, right? They granted cert. They needed to sort out this conflict between the lower courts and settle the question of whether CRSC really does displace the Barring Act. So this whole idea of no magic words needed, that's a pretty big shift from the Federal Circuit's view, isn't it?
Right.
How does that change things maybe for how Congress even writes laws if they know the court's going to look deeper?
It's a huge shift. Absolutely. The Supreme Court really dug into what settle means when we're talking about government claims. And they boiled it down to two things. First, figuring out if the claim is valid. Is it legit? Second, figuring out the amount of money the claimant is actually owed. They used an analogy, like a trusted administrator checking if a bill is real and then calculating the exact amount due, a two-step thing. And crucially, the court said Congress does not need to use specific magic words like settle or anything else. Instead, the court looks at the whole package, the text, context, and structure of the entire statutory scheme. It's about the big picture, the overall design, and looking at it that way, the CRSC law absolutely fits the bill. First, on validity. The CRSC law gives the secretary concerned, like the Navy Secretary for Sodto, the power to consider if someone is eligible. And that involves looking at detailed criteria for being a combat-related disabled uniformed services retiree. The court said, well, determining eligibility is determining the claim's validity. If you meet the criteria, your claim is valid. Simple as that. Then second, on the amount due. The law explicitly tells the secretary to pay a specific monthly amount. And it says that amount is determined under subsection B, and subsection B lays out precisely how to calculate the payments, max amounts, special rules, all of it. So the secretary isn't just giving a thumbs up or thumbs down, they are actively calculating how much based on what Congress wrote in the law.
Okay, so putting that all together, what's the bottom line for Simon Sodto and potentially thousands of other veterans? The court's conclusion was unanimous and clear. The CRSC statute, viewed as a whole, creates this unique, self-contained, comprehensive compensation scheme. And because it's so comprehensive, they found, it does authorize the secretary to figure out both validity and the amount owed. Which means, yes, it is another law with its own settlement mechanism, and that displaces the Barring Act's default rules, including that 6-year time limit. That's just a massive win for those veterans. They can get everything they were owed. Right.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court specifically pushed back on the Federal Circuit's earlier reasoning. They flat out rejected the need for magic words. They also rejected the idea that a law must have its own specific time limit to displace the Barring Act. The court acknowledged, yeah, Congress often puts in a statute of limitations, but they said, look, for a special group, like particularly deserving claimants, their words, such as combat disabled veterans, it's perfectly reasonable for Congress to decide not to include a time limit within that specific benefit scheme. Having a settlement mechanism doesn't automatically require its own stopwatch, essentially.
And the government had also tried arguing for, what do they call them? Hallmark formulations, like phrases about claims being allowed or disallowed, or decisions being final and conclusive. Did the court buy that?
No, not at all. They found those arguments just as unconvincing. They basically said that's just another version of the magic words test we already threw out.
So no secret handshakes or passwords needed, just Congress clearly setting up a complete system. Huh.
Precisely. And, beyond just this case, the government did raise a practical concern. They worried this ruling might destabilize other government programs if lots of laws could suddenly displace the Barring Act. But the court addressed that too. They were careful to say their decision was based on the combination of features in the CRSC law, the fact that it creates such a comprehensive system. It wasn't just one or two little things, it was the whole package. And they actually noted that the number of laws with all these comprehensive features is probably relatively small, so they weren't exactly opening the floodgates.
That touches on something important, too, about the court's role versus Congress's role. The court made it clear. Making policy choices, that's Congress's job. Even if, maybe, a different policy seemed more sensible, or if a narrower exception to the Barring Act might be better policy. That's not the court's call to make. Their job is just to read the law as Congress actually wrote it. They can't just rewrite it because they think they have a better idea. Okay, so let's pull this all together for everyone listening. What's the big takeaway? The Supreme Court's unanimous ruling in Sodto v. United States, it's a clear, decisive victory for veterans. Full stop. It means that combat-related special compensation, CRSC, isn't limited by that general 6-year Barring Act clock. Eligible veterans can now potentially claim the full compensation they were due, maybe going all the way back to 2008 when the rules changed. Just imagine being a veteran who's been caught up in this, maybe for years. What must that feel like to finally have that resolved?
It must be an incredible relief, a huge weight lifted. And, the significance goes beyond just this specific benefit. Think about what this ruling signals. It tells Congress, it tells agencies, don't just rely on boilerplate language or assumptions. If you intend for a program to operate comprehensively, design it that way. Lay out the whole system, because the court is willing to look at the entire purpose and structure, not just hunt for specific keywords. For the rest of us, it's maybe a reminder that sometimes the spirit and overall design of a law matter just as much, maybe more than the literal words used.
Yeah, and understanding how these legal gears turn, how these details that seem small can have such massive real-world consequences.
Yeah.
Especially for people who've served the country. It's so important. This decision feels like it's about fundamental fairness, really. Accountability, making sure that the benefits Congress intended for these veterans actually reach them in full. That's something, that resonates whether you have a direct military connection or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And it shows the court is committed to enforcing the full scope of what Congress intended for service members here. So here's maybe a final thought to chew on. How might this approach looking at the whole comprehensive system affect other government programs? Think about benefits designed for other specific, maybe particularly vulnerable or deserving groups. If Congress sets up a unique, detailed system for them, even if it doesn't explicitly mention a time limit, could that system also be shielded from general statutes like the Barring Act? How does looking at the entire statutory scheme, not just magic words, potentially change the landscape for access to justice or benefits for various groups? Definitely something to think about.